What is diplomacy? Diplomacy is the art and science of addressing conflicts by manipulating those in powerful positions by turning their power into weakness for universal welfare. Diplomacy is the art of negotiations and conduct of foreign relations, or the means for implementing foreign policy. The ability to find common ground and work toward a common cause with others. The art and practice of maintaining good relationships between countries. Diplomacy can be practiced between individuals, between countries, through large international summits, conferences, and organizations. Diplomacy is commonly regarded as the core of international relations. It is one of the most important and valuable instruments of foreign policy. It is mainly through diplomacy a nation communicates its wishes, desires, objectives and goals to other nations, and again it is through diplomatic negotiations that it attempts to secure objectives. Diplomacy forms the major link in the process of bilateral and multilateral relations among nations. Diplomacy is a process of negotiation and communication between states that seeks to resolve conflict without recourse to war, an instrument of foreign policy. Diplomacy can be defined as an instrument of national interest. It seeks to secure peacefully the goals of national interest in international politics. Diplomacy is the art and skill of conducting international relations. It is mostly through diplomatic negotiations that nations try to resolve their disputes or arrive at consensus regarding various international issues. It is an instrument of conflict management in international relations. In fact, the contemporary era has witnessed the art and practice of scientific knowledge in diplomacy. Today, the talents, the statesmanship of diplomats is cultivated through a well-designed program of selection and training to increase their skills and competence. As a scientific discipline, diplomacy now attracts the best mind of a state, who then get selected to perform diplomatic jobs through a well-planned scheme. State-run special institutes provide the knowledge and training to future diplomats, e.g. Foreign Service Institute in India. The evolutionary nature of diplomacy has changed significantly because of revolutionary growth in the field of mass communication. The massive developments in the technology of communications have refined modern diplomacy to hitherto unthinkable limits. Type of diplomacy. Political diplomacy. The political dimension of diplomacy is associated with state policies towards other states on political issues. The struggle for political power among states is the main factor behind the significance of political diplomacy. The element of political power remains the cornerstone of diplomacy. Political diplomacy is often very complicated in nature and no single actor may be credited with its formulation. Political diplomacy sets the global actors in motion to focus on problems through dialogue on negotiation, and contributes towards the stability of peace in the world. It helps promote states and people's faith in dialogue on not conflict or war. Military diplomacy. Military diplomacy is some way connected with political diplomacy nowadays. The very specialized field of military information may give any nation into weak or strong state. Diplomats of military advanced nations have an edge over their counterparts of less developed and developing nations. The show of military power on occasions of national days also reflects the success story of military diplomacy. Economic diplomacy/diplomacy of development. The economic interests of a state are promoted through diplomatic efforts. Economic interests implies trade and commerce, short-term and long-term interest in imports and exports in industrial, agricultural and other fields of mutual exchange programs. Regarding all these economic interests, agreements will take with utmost care by the diplomats. Economic diplomacy expresses itself through various modes. One of them, foreign aid, is often bound with strings of political strategies, political compromises and undersigned objectives and may put the opposite party in a tricky situation. today economic diplomacy has gained more significant rather other mode of diplomacy. Sometimes this turns into coercive diplomacy by putting extraordinary pressure over concerned state parties. The involvement of international financial institutions such as NATO, IMF, IBR, etc. added to the complex nature of economic institutions. Today all the countries eager to expand their economic arena as the economic Cold War between US and China. Cultural diplomacy. The cultural dimension of diplomacy has been gaining momentum nowadays. In fact, culture has always been a core subject of interaction between the officials and people of two states. Cultural diplomacy is an expandable, evolving and complex diffusion of culture through diplomatic efforts. Cultural agreements among states have taken under their umbrella a large number of activities such as the exchange of academicians, scientists, students, artists, sportspersons, journalists and so on. The functions, festivals, carnivals, exhibitions, book or literary fairs organized by embassies and high commissions are also part of cultural diplomacy, which strengthens and refines the art of diplomacy in the contemporary world. The UNESCO is one of the best platforms of cultural exchanges. The Charter of UNESCO emphasizes its goals to contribute towards international peace, security and development through cultural diplomacy. Other types of diplomacy: oil diplomacy, water diplomacy, crisis or emergency diplomacy, bus diplomacy, cricket diplomacy, nuclear diplomacy. Thank you. Do subscribe.